My name is Amy Lane. I'm 32 years old, a forensic accountant, and a woman who has spent over a decade auditing the hidden sins of others while willfully ignoring the insolvency of my own family. In my professional life, I track every dollar that attempts to vanish into the shadows of shell companies and offshore accounts. I am an expert at spotting a deficit before it becomes a disaster. Yet somehow, I allowed myself to become the primary creditor for a mother and sister who never intended to pay me back in the currency of love. My mother and sister once invited me to a fancy restaurant, ordered the finest lobster and vintage wine, and performed the role of high society with a grace that was entirely funded by my sweat. Then, they sat me at a small, wobbly table near the kitchen door and told the server to bring me their leftovers. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I simply smiled and said, "Check my mother's account." I watched her face turn the color of wet chalk. But before you can understand that moment of justice, you have to understand the day the ledger finally closed. You have to understand what kind of mother tells a hospital to send her grandson to a police station because she's busy with a face mask. Precisely at 3:14 p.m. Tuesday in Midtown Manhattan, the air was thick with humidity, the smell of hot asphalt, and the pungent metallic taste of expensive espresso. I was walking down Fifth Avenue, contemplating a client's overseas tax payment, when suddenly the world tilted like an explosion. The pain wasn't a sharp cut. It felt like a red-hot iron rod being twisted behind my ribs. My appendix had ruptured. I fell to my knees. I remember the rough texture of the sidewalk through my slacks and the blurry, hurried legs of tourists who walked around me like I was just another piece of urban debris. I felt the vibration of the street in my teeth. When the EMTs arrived, the scent of antiseptic was sudden and suffocating. My vision began to tunnel, but I wasn't thinking about my life. I was thinking about the 3:30 p.m. bell. Leo, my 7-year-old son, was standing at the school gate in Brooklyn Heights, waiting for a mother who was currently being loaded into an ambulance. By the time they wheeled me into NYU Langone, my sweat was cold and my speech was slurring. I was in the weakest state of my life, stripped of my professional armor, reduced to a patient ID number and a gown that tied at the back. I needed a savior. I reached for my phone with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. I called my mother, Sante. "Mom," I cried out, the pain making it hard to breathe. "I'm in the emergency room. My appendix has ruptured. I'm going to have surgery in 20 minutes. Please. You have to go pick up Leo from school. He's at the school gate. He'll be terrified." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the "I'm on my way." Instead, the call went to voicemail. I called my sister, Selene. No answer. Then my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our family group thread. The vibration against my collarbone felt like a death knell. I blinked through the haze to see a selfie Sante had just posted. She was at a high-end spa in the Hamptons with Selene. Her face was covered in a thick green clay mask, her eyes obscured by cucumber slices. The text followed. "Selene and I are in the middle of a silent retreat energy clearing session. I cannot break the flow, Amy. You always have to be so dramatic when I'm finally finding my peace. If you're so busy, tell the teacher to call the police. The station has officers who deal with this. It's safe and it's free. Don't ruin my afternoon." Selene liked the message. I stared at the screen. I didn't cry. Forensic auditors don't cry when they find a glaring error in the books. They just recognize the loss. At that moment, I realized that to the woman who gave me life, my son's safety was merely an interruption of energy flow. I wasn't a daughter. I was a liability that was inconveniently demanding a dividend. A nurse named Linda was standing over me, prepping an IV. She saw the screen. She saw the green clay mask and the cold words. She didn't say she was sorry. She just placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. "I've seen a lot of paperwork in this room, honey," she said quietly. "But that right there, that's a bankrupt soul. You do what you need to do." I didn't beg them again. I didn't send another text. I opened my contacts and called Elite Protection Services, a high-end security firm I had audited the year before. I authorized a $1,500 emergency dispatch fee. A professional stranger in a charcoal suit would be at the school gate in 10 minutes. He was a man who worked for a fee, and yet I knew he was more reliable than the people who shared my DNA. The price of safety was high, But for the first time in my life, I realized it was worth every penny to stop negotiating with people who didn't love me. As they began to wheel me toward the operating room, the heavy doors swinging open like the jaws of a whale, I made one last move. My thumb was steady now. I opened my banking app. I navigated to the scheduled transfers. There it was. Auto transfer. Sante Lane. $5,000. It was set for tomorrow. I hit cancel. Then I went to the authorized users on my secondary business account. Selene. Sante. I removed them. I revoked their access to the funds I had earned while they were clearing their energy. The feeling wasn't one of revenge. It was the profound lightness of a balanced ledger. I wasn't being cruel, I was simply acknowledging that the Bank of Amy Lane was closed for lack of collateral. Going under now, Amy, the anesthesiologist said. Good, I whispered. 3 days later, I was back in my quiet apartment. The surgical staples were itching under my skin, and the air was still, save for the hum of the city outside. My phone rang. It was Selene. It was the first time she had reached out since the hospital. Her voice wasn't frantic about my health or my recovery. It was sharp, entitled, and panicked. Amy, what the hell is going on? My card just got declined at the jewelry store, and Mom says her rent check bounced. What did you do? I looked at my reflection in the window, pale, tired, but finally awake. I didn't do anything, Selene, I said calmly. I just stopped paying for a life I'm no longer invited to. I hung up. I didn't block them yet. I wanted them to see what happens when the load-bearing beam finally decides to walk away. Now let me take you back to the fall of 2018, in the gilded cage of the Upper East Side Manhattan. To understand why a mother would suggest the police station as a daycare for her own grandson, you have to understand the ledger we were raised by. In our house, love wasn't a feeling. It was a hierarchy. It was a ranking system where your value was determined by how well you could maintain the family's social solvency. The Lane family operated like a dying monarchy. My mother, Sante, was the self-proclaimed queen of social capital. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about the light and how it hit the surface. My father, Gerald, was the silent treasurer. He had spent 40 years in corporate law and had eventually stopped checking the books at home, preferring the quiet of his study to the high-maintenance theater of his marriage. And then there was Aileen. If you looked at our family through Sante's eyes, Aileen was the curated masterpiece on the wall, the delicate, hand-painted porcelain that was far too fragile for the heavy lifting of reality. I, on the other hand, was the load-bearing beam in the basement. I was gray, functional, and expected to hold everything up without ever demanding a coat of paint. Aileen was celebrated for existing. I was managed for my utility. I remember the day I finished my forensic accounting master's. I had graduated at the top of my class, an achievement that required 3 years of 80-hour weeks and more black coffee than I care to recall. When I walked into the living room with my diploma, Sante didn't look up from her iPad. She was busy helping Aileen choose a vintage filter for a photo of a $400 brunch Aileen had hosted earlier that morning. "That's nice, Amy," Sante said, her eyes never leaving the screen where Aileen's filtered life was being polished for public consumption. She didn't ask about the graduation. She didn't suggest a celebratory dinner. Instead, she adjusted the brightness on a photo of a poached egg and said, "Now that you have a real job and a real salary, maybe you can help your sister with her boutique's rent. She's struggling with her brand identity. And you don't really have many expenses in that little apartment of yours, do you?" I stood there, holding a document that proved I was one of the best analytical minds in the state, and I realized my mother saw it only as a new line of credit for her favorite child. I didn't argue. I didn't say that my little apartment was all I could afford because I was paying off $30,000 in student loans. I just swallowed the lump in my throat and set the diploma on the side table, next to a stack of Aileen's fashion magazines. 6 months later, there was the Metropolitan Hospital Gala. Sante had spent weeks talking about it. Aileen arrived 2 hours late, draped in a silk gown that cost more than my first car, looking like a dream. Sante beamed, introducing her to every donor as the creative heart of the family. I arrived exactly on time, having come straight from a 12-hour shift auditing a construction firm. I was wearing a clean but sensible suit. Sante didn't introduce me. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of mint and expensive gin, and whispered, "Amy, you look so tired. You're making us look unrefined. Try to stay in the back near the refreshments so people don't ask if we're having financial trouble." That night, I watched from the shadows of the bar as Sante posted 17 photos of Aileen laughing under the chandeliers. The caption read, "So proud of my girls, the light of my life." I was in 3 of those photos. Or rather, I should have been. In every single one, I had been cropped out. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been erased. I remember staring at the screen of my phone on the subway ride home, the blue light reflecting in the window against the dark tunnel. I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, logical necessity to survive. I told myself it made sense. I rationalized it the way a bookkeeper rationalizes a bad debt. Aileen was fragile. She needed the spotlight to keep her ego from collapsing. I was the strong one. I was the accountant. I could handle the dark so they could stay in the light. It was a noble sacrifice, I told myself. I didn't realize then that a noble sacrifice is just a beautiful name for a slow suicide. The real trap was set a few weeks later. Sante invited me to a lunch I actually thought was for us. She smiled, that rare, warm smile she usually reserved for Aileen or a successful charity auction. She took my hand and told me she was so proud of how solvent I was. Then she mentioned a bridge loan. "It's just a formality, Amy," she whispered, her voice like silk. "I need to secure the deposit for the Hamptons property, but the bank is being so tedious with the paperwork because your father's income is tied up in the trust. If you just put your name as the primary on this one application, it would mean everything. It's for the family legacy. It's for our future." How much I longed for that smile. So desperately I wanted to be the good girl, oblivious to the small terms. The terms that tied my credit score to her capricious whims. I failed to see that I was more than just a signatory. I was also a mortgagor. I believed my ability to provide was my shield, my ultimate way of securing a place in the family. That favoritism wasn't simply affection. It was a carefully calculated business deal. Sante wasn't looking for a girlfriend. She just wanted a secure position. I thought I'd finally bought my way into her heart, but in reality, I was paying the maximum price for a love that had already run dry. And as the fall of 2018 turned into winter, the shadow of that debt began to grow, far exceeding any calculations I could make. 2 days after I returned to my apartment from the hospital, the air in my living room smelled of expensive peonies. They sat in a crystal vase on my coffee table, their heavy pink heads nodding as if in apology. Sante and Selene had arrived that morning, not with demands or grievances, but with organic bone broth and get-well-soon cards embossed with gold foil. It was a temperature swing so sudden it made me forget the ice-cold text message I'd received while on a gurney. Sante sat down on the edge of my sofa and did something she hadn't done since I was 7. She brushed my hair. Her hands were gentle, almost maternal. Now I understood. I thought the ice had finally melted, but they were just waiting for the tide to rise so they could set sail and pursue their own ambitions without my help. "You've been working so hard, Amy," Sante whispered, her voice a soft lullaby. "The firm must be so lucky to have you. Tell me about that new promotion. Is the salary bump as significant as they promised? And what about the trust funds you manage for those high-end clients? It must be so much responsibility." Because I was starved for that touch, because for 1 hour I wasn't the utility, but the daughter, I told them everything. I shared the details of my new security protocols, the exact percentage of my bonus, and my long-term investment plans for Leo's college fund. It felt like connection. I thought I was being seen. In reality, I was just being harvested. I was feeding them the very ammunition they would later use to try and sink me. Late that night after they had left, I sat up in bed, the surgical staples pulling at my skin. Out of habit, I opened my personal laptop. I navigated to the transaction history from the day of my surgery. $2,500. Hermes, Madison Ave. $1,200. Spa de la Mer. They had spent nearly $4,000 of my money while I was under general anesthesia, struggling to breathe. I stared at the cold glow of the screen. A rational mind would have called the bank and reported fraud. but a heart hungry for a mother's touch rationalizes the theft as a stress response. I told myself they were just overwhelmed. I told myself I could afford it. I was a forensic accountant, but I was cooking my own books to make the family's love look like a profit instead of a loss. The first direct ask came the next morning. Sante called, her voice a fragile, breathy whisper. "Amy, honey, just this once. I'm short on the HOA fees for the Upper East Side condo, only for a month. I'd asked Selene, but her boutique is having such a difficult quarter and she's so stressed. You're so successful you wouldn't even feel it." I looked at my savings account. I saw the numbers I had built with 2 a.m. audits and skipped vacations. My hand trembled as I hit send. I told myself it was a recovery tax, a fee for the soup and the peonies. Within 2 weeks, the one-time help had mutated into a recurring obligation. This was the ATM training, the slow, methodical process of being taught that my liquidity was my only redeeming quality. If I paid, I was part of the family. If I questioned the cost, I was hostile and unstable. The escalation followed a ladder I should have recognized. First, it was the $5,000 monthly allowance for Sante's lifestyle. Then came the $2,800 sublease subsidy for Selene's failing boutique. Then came the emergencies. A broken furnace, a legal fee, a social club membership that absolutely could not wait. Whenever I had a difficult day, whenever my side ached or I felt the weight of being a single parent, they were absent. But as soon as a bill was due, they were back in my living room, smelling of peonies and desperation. I began to keep a file. I called it Lane Family Logistics. It was a spreadsheet I kept hidden behind a triple encrypted firewall. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, reason. Column D, status. The status was always the same, unpaid. By the end of the second year, the total hit a shock number, $87,420. That was the price of my admission to their dinner table. Sante visited one final time before the dinner. She walked through my minimalist apartment, her eyes skimming over my practical furniture and my son's Lego sets on the floor. She sighed, a sound that managed to be both a compliment and a dismissal. "You're so lucky you're so independent and good with numbers, Amy," she said, smoothing her silk scarf. "You don't need us to worry about you like we do for Selene. You're the strong one. You don't even notice when you're alone, do you? It's a gift, really." The praise was a blade. It was the justification they used to ignore my surgery, my struggle, and my exhaustion. Because I was strong, I was eligible for exploitation. Because I was independent, I was a resource to be mined. "That's why we're doing this," Sante said, her eyes bright with a new, sharp excitement. "To celebrate your recovery and your success, we're taking you to the Obsidian on Friday night. Just us 3. No kids, no drama. Let's be a family again, Amy. You've earned it." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a mother. I saw a predator who had finally cornered its prey. I handed them the key. I gave them every detail they needed to build the stage for my public humiliation. I didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was already scheduled for 7 p.m. on Friday night, and I was the only one who knew the bank was already empty. Tuesday, 3:14 p.m. That's when the ledger of my life stopped balancing. I was standing in the middle of NYU Langone's lobby, having driven myself there through a haze of white-hot pain that made the steering wheel feel like a live wire. In my line of work, we talk about catastrophic failure, the point where a system cannot be recovered. My body had reached it. The rupture felt like a hot iron being twisted in my gut, a slow, searing expansion that forced the air out of my lungs. My vision blurred, the high-gloss floors of the hospital stretching out into an infinite, nauseating mirror. The smell of floor wax and old coffee became overwhelming, thick enough to taste. I heard the frantic beep of a monitor nearby and the squeak of rubber soles on tile as a team moved toward me, but my mind was elsewhere. I looked at my watch. It was 3:19 p.m. Leo's school in Brooklyn Heights lets out at 3:30 p.m. On a good day, it's a 20-minute drive. On a Tuesday afternoon with a ruptured appendix, it's an impossible distance. The school's policy is etched into my brain. If a child isn't picked up by 4 p.m., they call the precinct. I had exactly 41 minutes to find a savior for my 7-year-old son before he became a ward of the state for the night. I was on a gurney now, the ceiling lights passing overhead like strobes. A nurse with a no-nonsense badge and graying hair tucked behind her ears was trying to find a vein in my left arm. Her name was Linda. Her touch was efficient, cold, and strangely grounding. "I need to make a phone call," I said, my voice hoarse. "My son. No one's come to pick him up." I didn't ask for love. I didn't ask for a prayer. I reached for my phone and dialed Sante. I needed logistics. I needed a grandmother to do what grandmothers are historically designed to do. "Mom," I said as soon as she picked up, though I could hear music and laughter in the background. "I'm in the ER. My appendix ruptured. I'm going into surgery in 20 minutes. Please, you have to pick up Leo. He's at the gate. Just for tonight." The call ended abruptly. I didn't get a "stay brave" or "I'm coming." Instead, my phone buzzed with a notification in the Lane family thread. It was a group message, a digital evidence locker of their priority list. Sante had sent a selfie. She and Selene were leaning back in white robes, green clay masks hardening on their faces, holding glasses of sparkling water. Sante: "Amy, we are at the Hampton Zen Retreat. I paid $4,000 for this energy clearing session and I am in a state of flow. I can't leave. Tell the teacher to let the police take him. They have toys at the station. He'll be fine. Don't be so dramatic." Selene liked the message. I stared at the scene icon on the bottom of the screen. The pain in my abdomen was a roar, but the sudden hollow silence in my chest was deafening. The energy flow of a spa day was worth more than the safety of a grandson. I felt Nurse Linda's hand steadying my arm. She was leaning over, her eyes fixed on my phone screen. She saw the green clay. She saw the laughing emoji. She didn't look away. "I'm a mandatory reporter, honey," Linda said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register. "If you want, I can document this. That's not a family, that's a liability." I didn't answer. I just gave a single microscopic nod. I watched her take a quick photo of the screen with her own device, a witness to the deficit. I didn't have time to be a victim. I opened my contacts and called Elite Protection Services, the firm I'd audited 6 months ago. I knew their response times. I knew their protocols. "Triple the rate," I whispered to the dispatcher, my consciousness beginning to slip. "Dispatch a car to Brooklyn Heights Elementary. Leo Lane, Code Alpha." "Do not let the police touch him. Just get him home." "Understood, Miss Lane. We're on it." Nurse Linda handed me a heavy plastic binder. It was the emergency patient admission form, case number #NYU 7721. With hands heavy as lead, I wrote Elite Protection Services as the primary emergency contact. I provided my insurance claim number and company ID. I was creating a written record of their absence, a chronological log of the moment they chose cucumbers instead of their loved ones. By 3:55 p.m., just as the anesthesiologist was prepping the IV, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a photo from the security firm. Leo was in the back of a black SUV, clutching a juice box, looking confused but safe. The driver, a professional stranger, had a hand on the seat as he looked back at my son. The weight in my chest settled. I was being wheeled into the cold, bright theater of the operating room. I looked at the white walls and the sterile equipment. I realized that the surgeons about to cut into me cared more about my internal integrity than my own mother did. The aftermath was 3 days of morphine, white noise, and the constant rhythmic beep of the monitor. I lay there in the quiet, looking at my hospital bracelet, a cheap blue strip of plastic. It was a tiny thing, but it represented more care, more recognition, and more duty than every piece of jewelry Santa had ever bought with my money. I didn't block them. I didn't send an angry reply. I just kept the phone on the bedside table, a silent recording device for the fallout I knew was coming. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. Strangers showed up. My family didn't. Strangers took better care of my son for a fee than my own blood would for free. That was the day I realized I wasn't a daughter. I was just a convenience they had finally outgrown. The old road was closed, and I was the only one who knew the bridge had been burned. 4 days post-op. I sat in my minimalist Brooklyn apartment, the air sterile and thin. It smelled of rubbing alcohol and the faint, dying scent of the peonies Selene had sent, which were now wilting in the bottom of my kitchen trash can. The surgical tape tugged at my skin every time I shifted in my chair, a sharp physical reminder that my body had survived something my spirit was still processing. I drank cold coffee and watched the gray New York sky press against the window. I wasn't crying, I was calculating. A forensic auditor doesn't panic when she finds a hole in a company's balance sheet. She prepares the paperwork to close it. My family was a corporation that had been insolvent for a decade, and I was the only one still providing the liquidity. As I watched my reflection in the darkened glass, a single thought crystallized, a pivot from the victim I had been on that gurney to the architect I needed to be. There are only two options, I whispered to the empty room. You keep bleeding for people who enjoy the sight of blood, or you stop the flow. You build a wall, or you stay a bridge they walk over until you collapse. I'm done being a bridge. I've chosen to build. I moved to my desk. The blue light of my high-end audit laptop illuminated my face, casting a clinical glow across the room. I opened my banking app and navigated to the Recurring Payments tab. This was the ledger of my exploitation, a list of auto transfers that stared back at me like parasites under a microscope. It was a digital map of how much I had allowed them to take in exchange for a seat at a table that was built to keep me small. I didn't hesitate. I began the cut, working through the list with the cold, surgical precision of a checklist. Cancel, Sante Lane, luxury living allowance, $5,000. Click. Cancel, Selene's boutique, sublease subsidy, $2,800. Click. Switch. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, move to a hardware security key. No more forgotten password recovery requests from Sante's device. Block, Lane family. Group chat. Mute. Archive, the screenshots of the cops at the station text. Locked. There was no dramatic music, no loud arguments, no tears. It felt like a burden had been lifted from my shoulders, a burden I had carried for half my life. The silence in the apartment no longer made me feel lonely. It was like a safe haven. It was a boundary protecting what truly mattered. The silence didn't hurt. It healed. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. It wasn't the family. It was Thatcher, the manager of the Obsidian. He was a man who respected the precision of my forensic work, and he was calling to confirm the reconciliation dinner Sante had scheduled for Friday night. Amy, Thatcher said, his voice a professional baritone. I wanted to confirm the reservation for 3. Your mother was quite insistent on the vintage selection in the Royal Lobster Tower. She mentioned you were unwell, but that you would be handling the corporate billing as usual. Thatcher, I said, my voice steady. I have a specific logistics request for Friday night. My mother is under the impression I am paying for this performance. I need you to follow my lead and keep the Casio ready. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that exists between professionals who understand the gravity of an audit. Understood, Miss Lane, Thatcher replied. We will be ready. I set the phone down and looked at a sealed envelope sitting on my desk. It was a nomination for a lead auditor position at a top-tier international firm. I hadn't opened it yet. I wasn't ready to step into my future until I had officially cleared the bad debt of my past. I needed to ensure that when I walked away, there were no lingering liabilities. I knew the fallout was coming. I knew they would notice the missing money long before they noticed my physical absence. I was just waiting for the invitation to the feast they couldn't afford. Sante thought she was inviting me to a reconciliation. She didn't realize she was inviting me to the final audit. I thought the hard part was saying no. I didn't expect the invitation to my own execution would arrive so soon, but I was prepared. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and my family was about to learn that physics, much like a balanced ledger, does not negotiate. Friday morning in Brooklyn Heights began with the smell of blueberry pancakes and the steady, rhythmic sound of my son humming while he packed his school bag. My apartment had become a sanctuary of honest numbers and quiet corners. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy with the expectation of someone else's crisis. I watched Leo snap his backpack shut, a clean, decisive sound, and realized that this was what peace felt like. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was the presence of security. Despite the calm, there was a lingering ache between my ribs, a phantom sensation of a debt that hadn't been fully discharged. It was the habit of reaching for my phone to check the Lane family group chat, only to remember I had muted it. It was the 3 plates on the table when I had spent a lifetime trying to set a 4th for a mother who never intended to show up. At 9:14 a.m., my phone vibrated on the granite countertop. It wasn't the family. It was Thatcher, the general manager from the Obsidian. "Amy," he said, his voice professionally guarded and low. "I'm calling to confirm the 7 p.m. reservation under Sante Lane. She has called the front desk 4 times this morning to verify the corporate billing account. She's already putting on a performance for the staff. Are we still proceeding with the specific protocol we discussed?" "Yes, Thatcher," I replied, looking at my reflection in the window. "Follow the timeline. Every detail matters tonight." At 5:30 p.m., a knock echoed through my foyer. It wasn't a guest. It was a courier delivering a gift from my sister. I opened the box to find a cheap, flashy cocktail dress, sequins that caught the light like broken glass, and a note written in Selene's aggressive, loopy script. "Amy, wear this. Try to look like you belong in Midtown for once. Don't make Mom embarrassed of her recovery project." I didn't wear the dress. I didn't even put it in my closet. I left it in the box by the door. Instead, I put on my charcoal gray audit suit. It was the suit I wore when I had to dismantle a CEO's lies in a boardroom. Tailored, sharp, and invisible until it was too late to look away. I kissed Leo goodbye, making sure he was settled with the executive security guard I now paid for, and stepped into the humid New York evening. 6:14 p.m. I hailed a yellow cab. I watched the steel cables of the Manhattan Bridge flicker past like a ledger being flipped. I checked my phone every 4 minutes. Not for messages. I knew there would be dozens of frantic texts once the wine was poured, but for the automated alerts from my firm's forensic software. At 6:55 p.m., the cab pulled up to the curb of the Obsidian. Simultaneously, a black stretch limo, rented under my corporate name without authorization, glid to a halt in front of the restaurant. Sante and Selene stepped out, draped in fur stoles and egos, laughing loudly enough to draw the attention of the doorman. They didn't see me in the cab. They were too busy admiring their own reflection in the gold-trimmed glass. Walking into the lobby was like entering a lion's den where the lions didn't realize the gate had already been locked. Sante spotted me and immediately pulled Thatcher aside. I was close enough to hear her stage whisper, her voice dripping with a calculated, patronizing pity. "Thatcher, darling. My youngest daughter, Amy. She's quite unstable. Post-operative depression. She has these erratic episodes. Please, seat her at that small table by the kitchen entrance. She can't handle the noise of the main floor. It's for her own safety, you understand." Thatcher looked at me, his gaze a fleeting coldness, a look of professional respect. I nodded slightly. He led them to the center table, a high chair beneath a $50,000 crystal chandelier. Then he led me to a tiny wooden table set against the service corridor. I sat down, my back against the wall, watching the staff hurry past with silver trays and glasses. I was a variable erased in their social equation. Before the menus were even opened, Selene leaned across the main table and slid a thick manila folder towards Sante. She looked back at me and smirked, her fingers patting the paper with a triumphant flourish. I saw the header in bold black ink. Transfer of deed. Brooklyn Heights property. I didn't need to read the rest. I saw my father's signature at the bottom of the page. It was a perfect copy, the slant of the G, the loop of the L, but the ink was too fresh, a dark, heavy blue that hadn't had time to settle into the fibers. My sister thought she had just stolen my home while I was in a hospital bed. She thought she had successfully audited my life and found it wanting. I felt the weight of my grandmother's Casio calculator in my blazer pocket. Sante caught my eye from across the room, raising a glass of sparkling water she hadn't yet paid for. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a conquered subject sitting in the shame seat. I didn't look away. I just tapped the face of my watch. 7:08 p.m. The first bottle of wine was about to be uncorked, and the audit of the Lane family was officially in session. The morning of the dinner, I spent 4 hours in my home office. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the laser printer and the occasional staccato click of my mouse. I watched the bank statements slide out of the tray, the papers still hot to the touch, smelling of toner and finality. I organized them chronologically, from the first loan in 2016 to the most recent unauthorized ATM withdrawal in 2026. I snapped the pages into a heavy, black leather binder. I used red tabs to mark the unauthorized corporate transfers and yellow tabs for the forged signatures. My hands were steady, though a slight tremor lived in my fingertips, not from fear, but from the kinetic energy of a decade's worth of silence finally being converted into data. I wasn't preparing to win an argument. I was preparing to establish a record. In my world, facts don't need a loud voice to be heard. They just need to be documented. I met Thatcher at the service entrance of the Obsidian 20 minutes before the reservation. He took the binder, his fingers skimming over the dividers. He stopped at the summary page, his eyes locking onto the shock number at the bottom. $342,118.54. He looked up at me, his face a mask of professional steel, the kind of expression men wear when they are about to witness a demolition. "They told me you were an unstable burden, Amy," Thatcher whispered, his voice barely audible over the clatter of silver in the kitchen. "They said you were confused about the numbers, but the numbers don't look confused to me. Let the paper do the talking tonight, Miss Lane." "Thank you, Thatcher," I said. I adjusted the lapel of my charcoal blazer. I didn't smile, I just breathed. The restaurant was a sea of crystal chandeliers, low-frequency chatter, and the scent of expensive lilies. It felt less like a dining room and more like a tribunal. As I walked through the lobby, carrying my binder like a briefcase, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my cousin, Indira. "Amy, be careful. Sante is telling everyone at the yacht club you had a psychotic break after the surgery. She's telling people you're sensitive and erratic, and that she's had to take over your affairs to save you from yourself. She's discrediting the witness before you even arrive." I closed the message. It was a classic smear campaign, social gaslighting designed to make my truth look like a symptom of a mental collapse. They weren't just stealing my money anymore. They were attempting to erase my sanity to justify the theft. Sante and Selene were already at the bar when I approached. Sante turned to me with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, wide enough to look maternal to onlookers, but thin enough to let me know I was still an intruder. "Oh, Amy, darling," Sante said, her voice projecting just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. You look like you're trying. Are you feeling better? The anesthesia can be so disorienting for someone with your history." She reached for my arm, her manicured nails like talons. I stepped back, maintaining exactly 30 inches of professional space. "I am fine, Mrs. Lane," I said. I saw her flinch at the name. I had dropped the title of mother at the hospital door. "I'm ready for the audit." "Always so dramatic," she chuckled, turning to a group of socialites nearby. "She's been so confused since the accident. We had to seat her at a smaller table for her own peace. The breakdown was quite significant." Thatcher led them to the central table, the throne table, right under the main chandelier. Then he led me to a tiny, rickety table by the kitchen door. I sat in the shade of the service corridor, watching them work. Sante ordered king lobster and 2 bottles of 2018 vintage wine that cost more than my first month's rent. She played the queen, chatting cheerfully with the waiters and nodding to acquaintances, her laughter echoing like jingles on the floor. I sat in silence. I didn't order food. I didn't even order a drink. I just opened the file on the table and waited. I watched them raise their glasses to toast their newly administered future. I watched Selene pat the brown file containing my forged property papers. I wasn't an angry daughter. I was a criminal investigator witnessing a case unfolding. I wasn't forgotten by this family. I had been deliberately erased so they could fill that void with my assets. At 8:15 p.m., Thatcher caught my eye from across the dining room. He didn't speak. He just gave a slight, sharp nod and placed a small silver tray on the edge of the bar. It was the signal. Sante stood up. She tapped her crystal wineglass with a sterling silver spoon, the sharp ping silencing the room. She looked around at the prestigious crowd, her face glowing with a false, practiced grace. "Before we begin our main course," Sante announced, her voice carrying a tone of benevolent authority, The family should know something about our recent transition. As many of you may have heard, Amy hasn't been herself lately, and as her mother, I've had to make some very difficult decisions regarding her estate. She reached for the folder with the forged deed. She was about to announce my bankruptcy to the world. I put my hand on the leather binder. The silence in the room was absolute, like the air before a lightning strike. The air in the obsidian was a heavy blend of expensive truffle oil, aged mahogany, and the fragile perfume of people who spend thousands to be noticed. At the center table, bathed in the warm amber glow of the main chandelier, Sante and Selene were laughing. They were surrounded by socialites from table 4, the kind of people who measure friendship by the vintage of the wine poured. From their throne, my mother and sister looked untouchable, a curated portrait of Upper East Side stability. I sat at the small, rickety table by the kitchen door. I was a ghost in my own execution. I didn't order food. My only companion was a glass of tap water, the condensation slowly forming winding curves down the side like silent tears I didn't want to shed. I watched them through the lens of a forensic auditor. I saw Sante adjust her fur shawl, a gesture designed to catch the light on the diamond bracelet I'd paid for 3 Christmases ago. I saw Selene tap the file lightly on the table, her smile sharp and predatory. Sante stood up, her crystal glass catching the light. The low hum of the restaurant faded as she projected her voice, her tone a masterpiece of benevolent pity. "We are so blessed to have our family back together tonight," Sante announced to the neighboring tables. "Even with Amy's recent complications, it's a heavy burden, managing someone who simply cannot manage themselves. But what is a mother for, if not to carry the weight of her children's failures?" The socialites nodded, murmuring words like grace and strength. Sante beamed, absorbing their admiration like a sponge. She was building her own gallows with every word of false sacrifice, and she didn't even know the rope was already around her neck. Then came the moment she had been rehearsing. Sante railed her hand, beckoning a waiter over. She reached into a small shopping bag at her feet and pulled out a grease-stained paper bag filled with cracked lobster shells, half-eaten sourdough, and a used linen napkin. "Take this to my daughter," Sante said, her voice ringing clear across the dining room. "She's always had a taste for what others leave behind. It's easier for her to digest than a real life." The waiter placed the bag of scraps on my wobbly table. The silence in the room became a physical weight, cold and suffocating. People looked away, their faces a mix of secondhand embarrassment and morbid curiosity. I didn't push the bag away. I didn't cry. I sat perfectly still, my spine a rod of carbon steel. I looked at Sante. I counted 10 heartbeats, watching the triumph dancing in her eyes. The silence was no longer a sign of my submission. It was the pressure of an impending collapse. Thatcher walked out from behind the bar. He didn't go to the center table to offer more wine. He walked straight to my small, broken table. He stood at attention, his shadow falling across the bag of lobster shells. "Miss Lane," Thatcher said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a scalpel. "The forensic audit is complete. The silver tray is ready." Thatcher turned and walked to Sante's table. He placed a silver platter directly on top of her silk runner. On it sat 2 things: my grandmother's old scuffed Casio calculator and a thick, black leather binder tabbed with red and yellow markers. I stood up. The table creaked and groaned as I moved. I walked to the middle of the room, my footsteps echoing like a hammer striking the wooden floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I've spent 10 years balancing the books for everyone but myself," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. I picked up the Casio. Click, click, click. The sound of the plastic keys was the only noise in the room. 8 years of bridge loans that were never intended to be repaid. $342,000 in unauthorized corporate transfers. $12,000 in forged signatures, including the one on the deed my sister is currently holding. I looked at the socialites at table 4. They were no longer nodding. They were leaning back, their expressions shifting from pity to horror as the data hit the air. "My mother didn't carry my weight," I said, looking Sante dead in the eye. "She lived on it. She treated my son's safety like an energy clearing session and my bank account like a family inheritance she hadn't earned. Sante laughed, a shrill, brittle sound. She's delusional. She's unstable. Thatcher, call security and get this girl out of here. I smiled. It was the first time I had felt my face move in days. Check your account, Mother. The primary one. The one you used to rent that limo and pay for this vintage wine. Sante's hands shook as she fumbled for her iPhone. She opened her banking app. I watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her a sickly, translucent gray. The screen reflected in her wide eyes. Balance: $124,118.54. I had triggered the forensic clawback and the frozen asset order 5 minutes before Thatcher walked out. Every penny she had attempted to move during my surgery had been flagged as fraudulent and reversed. Her rich life was currently a 6-figure debt. The socialites at Table 4 didn't offer a word of support. They physically slid their chairs away from her as if insolvency was a contagious disease. Selene stared at her plate, her fingers white as she gripped the forged folder, a document that was now nothing more than a confession. I looked at Sante one last time. I didn't come here to shame you, I said softly. I came here to stop being the collateral for your lies. You want to act rich? Try acting honest. If you want to have a seat at a table in this city, you can pay for it yourselves. That is the boundary. I picked up my grandmother's calculator and tucked it into my pocket. I set my water glass down on Sante's white tablecloth, deliberately leaving a ring of moisture on the corner of the forged deed. I turned and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back to see if she was crying or screaming. I didn't need to. I could hear the heavy, final silence of a family that had finally run out of credit. The obsidian faded into my rearview mirror, a fortress of mahogany and crystal that had become a crime scene for a legacy of lies. The expensive silence of the dining room was replaced by the staccato flickering of blue and red lights from the NYPD cruiser parked at the curb. I didn't need to stay to watch the fallout. A forensic auditor knows that once the numbers are balanced, the case is closed. Inside, the implosion was absolute. As Thatcher explained the technicalities of the frozen corporate account to the officers, Selene did exactly what a parasite does when the host stops providing. She detached. She didn't defend Sante. She didn't offer a credit card. She simply grabbed her designer clutch, avoided the gaze of her former friends, and slipped out the service exit, leaving our mother to face the $1,200 bill and the looming fraud investigation alone. Sante was forced to leave her diamond earrings and her iPhone 14 Pro Max as collateral before Thatcher personally walked her to the sidewalk. Her photograph is now taped to the server station in the back. Banned for life. The final anchor dropped just as Sante reached the curb. My father, Gerald, arrived not in a limo, but in a quiet taxi, holding Leo's hand. He didn't look at the remnants of the lobster or the vintage wine. He walked up to Sante and placed a heavy white envelope on the silver tray next to her half-eaten sourdough. It was a summons for divorce. "The police aren't here for my son, Sante," he said, his voice as steady as granite. "They're here for you. I'm taking my grandson home." 3 months have passed since that Friday night. New York is leaning into spring, and the air in Brooklyn Heights finally feels breathable. The social evaporation of Sante Lane was slow but inevitable. The socialites from Table 4 didn't send cards or call. They just stopped answering. In a world built on the appearance of wealth, the smell of debt is the ultimate repellent. My phone occasionally buzzes with messages from Mom. Not apologies, but accusations. "You ruined the family. How can you live with yourself?" I don't argue. I've learned that you cannot use the truth to convince someone whose entire identity is committed to a lie. Last week, one of Sante's oldest friends reached out. She didn't mention the spa or the energy clearing. She called me Miss Lane instead of the youngest. "I didn't know the depth of it," she said quietly. I just nodded. I am no longer the unstable burden in their narrative. The smear campaign failed because facts have a way of outlasting whispers. I am sitting at my desk now, watching Leo sleep through the monitor. I open my laptop to the folder labeled Lane Family Logistics. It's 10 years of digital clutter, a decade of pain captured in PDF form. I highlight the entire directory. My finger hovers over the key. I hit delete. The sound of the empty trash bin is the loudest thing in the room. I realized that night at the Obsidian that I didn't need Sante to love me to know I am worthy. I didn't need Selene to acknowledge me to know I am capable. I am Amy Lane. I am defined by the boundaries I set, not the accounts I fund. To anyone currently carrying a weight that was never meant for your shoulders, put it down. You will be surprised at how light the world feels when you stop paying for a seat at a table that was designed to keep you small. The world didn't fall apart when I finally said no. It just finally started spinning in the right direction.